I wasn't looking for giants when I started this investigation. I was researching the unusual architectural uniformity of mid-19th century civic buildings across the American West. The strange consistency of their proportions, the almost mechanical precision of their stonework, the sheer scale of interior spaces that seemed designed for something other than the modest frontier populations they supposedly served. That was my original inquiry. Oversized courthouses in towns of 300 people, cathedrals with nave heights that dwarfed their congregations, train depots with ceilings so high that the human beings moving beneath them looked, in the old photographs, like children in a world built for someone else. That was what I was studying. And then, almost by accident, I found the photographs from Lovelock Cave, not the cleaned-up institutional versions, not the images that appear in the brief footnotes of anthropology textbooks. I found the original field documentation from 1912, the handwritten survey logs, the inventory sheets filled out in the careful cursive of men who were clearly struggling to describe what they were seeing without sounding like they had lost their minds. And buried in those documents, cross-reference against oral testimony collected from northern Paiute elders in the 1880s, I found something that official archaeology has spent over a century quietly walking backward from. The Paiute people had a name for them. Sitisich, red-haired, cannibalistic, enormous, a race of beings so threatening that, according to the oral tradition preserved across multiple Great Basin tribes, the indigenous nations formed an unprecedented coalition to drive them into a cave and burn them alive. For generations, this was treated as mythology, colorful folklore, the kind of story that archaeologists gnawed at politely before returning to their measurements and their grand applications. But then the measurements themselves started telling a different story, and that is where the official explanations began to collapse. The excavation of Lovelock Cave, located approximately 90 miles northeast of Reno, Nevada, in Pershing County, began in earnest in 1912 under the direction of commercial guano miners before academic institutions recognized the significance of what was being unearthed. The Lovelock Cave site sits at the edge of what was once the shoreline of ancient Lake Lahontan, a Pleistocene-era body of water that covered vast portions of the Great Basin before retreating roughly 10,000 years ago. This geographic context matters enormously because the oral traditions of the Paiute specifically place the Sitisich as a lake-dwelling people, a detail that archaeology, almost despite itself, confirmed. What the 1912 excavation produced, and what subsequent excavations in 1924 and 1929 continue to uncover, was deeply unusual by any standard measure. The artifacts recovered filled the inventory logs with items that created immediate interpretive problems. Duck decoys woven from tule reeds, 14 of them, some still bearing traces of original paint, that predated by centuries the supposed introduction of such craft techniques in the region. Woven baskets of extraordinary complexity. Textile fragments using a twining technique that archaeologists initially classified as inconsistent with known Great Basin cultures of that period. But it was the physical remains themselves that created the most persistent problem. The Lovelock specimens, when examined by the original field teams and documented in reports submitted to what would become the Nevada State Museum, included skeletal material that exceeded contemporary human norms by a significant margin. Femur measurements recorded in the 1912 survey logs, documents I have personally reviewed in archival form, suggest stature estimates that range, depending on reconstruction methodology, between 7 and 8 feet. The skulls recovered were proportionally elongated, with cranial volumes that fell outside the normal distribution for contemporaneous Great Basin populations. The hair, recovered in remarkable condition thanks to the cave's dry alkaline environment, was documented repeatedly as red to reddish-brown, a detail so anomalous for the region that multiple independent observers recorded it independently, which is itself a form of corroboration. The grain of those photographs matches the period. The documentation predates the technology to convincingly fabricate such records. The handwriting on those inventory sheets belongs to men who had no theoretical framework within which to be deliberately deceptive. They were miners and early career archaeologists trying to do their jobs. So what does official archaeology say? The standard institutional position, as maintained by the Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology and reflected in the public-facing materials of the Nevada State Museum, is that the size estimates were exaggerated, that the red hair was the result of chemical processes acting on darker hair over centuries of burial, and that the oral traditions of the Paiute people represent legend rather than historical record. Each of these dismissals is technically possible, but what strikes me as significant is how quickly they were adopted, how uniformly they were repeated across institutions with no apparent cross-examination, and how completely they shut down further investigation rather than opening it. The official explanation, in each case, arrived before the full analysis was complete. That is not how science is supposed to work. There are researchers, not fringe bloggers, but credentialed academics working in physical anthropology, who have quietly noted that the femur lengths documented in the Lovelock records are inconsistent with the chemical shrinkage hypothesis that the institutional position relies upon. Bone does not shrink in the direction that would make those measurements misleading. The dimensions are what they are. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. What stopped me from filing Lovelock away as an isolated anomaly was the moment I began mapping the distribution of similar oral traditions across the American continent, and then, with increasing unease, across the world. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In the Great Lakes region, the account of the Menominee people describe a race of giants, the Manetowac, who inhabited the earth before the current peoples arrived. The physical evidence from the mound-building cultures of the Ohio Valley has generated its own contested literature, with reports of oversized skeletal remains from Miamisburg, Ohio in 1897, from Chesterville, Ohio in 1901, and from a site near Sayre, Pennsylvania in 1916, where excavations reportedly produced remains measuring nearly 9 feet, documented by faculty from what was then the Pennsylvania Museum and temporarily housed before their disappearance from the institutional record. Moving south, the oral traditions of the Aztec explicitly describe a pre-existing race of giants, the Quinametsin, who built the great structures before the current age of humanity. In the Andes, the Tiwanaku construction complex near Lake Titicaca in present-day Bolivia exhibits doorways and passages with proportions that, as architectural historian Jean-Pierre Pratzen noted in his 1993 study of Inca construction techniques, appear calibrated to a human form somewhat larger than the populations who subsequently used and maintained them. In the British Isles, the figure of the giant is so embedded in the place name record, Gogmagog Hills in Cambridgeshire, Giant's Causeway in County Antrim, the Cernobos giant carved into a Dorset hillside, that mainstream scholarship treats it as metaphor while carefully not explaining why the metaphor is so consistent, so geographically precise, and so uniformly associated with a pre-existing civilization rather than a supernatural one. In St. Petersburg, the collections of the Kunstkamera, founded by Peter the Great in 1714 specifically to house anomalous specimens, include skeletal material that Peter himself documented as belonging to individuals of extraordinary stature. In Delhi, the Mughal imperial records reference excavations near Fate Sikri that produce remains described by court historians as belonging to a people of remarkable physical scale. In Buenos Aires, the natural history collections assembled by Francisco Javier Muniz in the 1830s and 1840s included specimens later reclassified, or simply withdrawn from the catalog under circumstances that were never formally explained. The same time window, the same institutional response, the same disappearance from the public record. Who were they built for? And here is where the investigation forced me to engage with something I had, for years, considered too speculative to take seriously. In the cartographic record of the 17th and 18th centuries, in maps produced by Venetian, Dutch, French, and German cartographers working from independent sources, there appears, occupying a vast portion of Central Asia and extending in some projections across Siberia and into the American Northwest, an entity labeled Tartaria or Tartary or Grand Tartary, not a legend, not a myth, a named, mapped, administratively defined political entity that appears consistently across the cartographic record from approximately 1600 to approximately 1820. The 1771 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica devotes a substantial entry to it. John Speed 1626 Atlas maps it in detail. Guillaume Delisle, the French royal cartographer, places it in his 1700 work with the same confident precision he applies to France or the Ottoman Empire. and then it stops appearing. Not because it was conquered. No conquest is recorded in the histories we were taught. Not because it was renamed. No successor state carries its institutional legacy. It simply ceases to exist in the cartographic and historical record across the early 19th century, across multiple countries, multiple languages, multiple independent cartographic traditions. All of them stopped mentioning it within roughly the same generation. When I began cross-referencing the distribution of Lovelock-type anomalous remains with the territorial boundaries of Tartaria as represented on these historical maps, something became impossible to ignore. The Great Basin, Nevada, Utah, the territory surrounding ancient Lake Lahontan, falls within the zones that the older maps identify as the eastern frontier territories associated with Tartarian administrative reach. The architecture uniformity I had originally been studying, those oversized civic buildings of the mid-19th century American West, built with a precision and a scale that the frontier populations of the time could neither have financed nor technically executed, matches the construction signatures attributed to Tartarian-adjacent territories in the historical record. The Ctsh, as described in Paiute oral tradition, are lake-dwelling, red-haired people who arrive from elsewhere. The Paiute are specific about this. The Ctsh were not native to the Great Basin. They came to it from somewhere. The connection between the physical evidence at Lovelock, the oral tradition of the Paiute people, and the existence of a vast, suddenly erased civilization on the historical maps becomes impossible to ignore. What complicates the institutional dismissal of all this evidence is the newspaper record, not the filtered, retrospectively curated historical summaries we encounter in academic bibliographies, but the original contemporary press coverage, which tells a story that was never supposed to be assembled into a single narrative. The Humboldt Star, 1912. Initial wire reports from the Lovelock excavation describe skeletal remains of extraordinary dimensions and hair of a distinctly reddish character preserved in remarkable condition, with a correspondent noting that the lead excavator, L.L. Loud of the University of California, declined to offer a formal interpretation pending laboratory analysis that was subsequently published in a form substantially more cautious than the field documentation warranted. The Nevada State Journal, 1924, coverage of the second Lovelock excavation, conducted by M.R. Harrington of the Museum of the American Indian, includes an account of additional skeletal material recovered from the lower strait of the site, described in the paper's reporting as consistent with the earlier findings and scale, with Harrington quoted as noting that the preservation was exceptional by any standard. The follow-up stories that would have tracked the laboratory analysis of this material simply do not appear. The story dies in a record as if by consensus. The Reno Evening Gazette, 1931, a brief item, buried in the interior pages, references a private collector who claimed to have purchased several artifacts from the Lovelock site through an intermediary, describing among them a sandal whose dimensions suggested a foot length of approximately 22 inches. The collector is named. The intermediary is named. Neither name appears in any subsequent institutional inventory or chain of custody documentation. The Sacramento Daily Union, 1896, a pre-Lovelock item, reporting on excavations near Unionville, Nevada, describes the recovery of bones of human aspect, but a scale inconsistent with any known variety of man, documented by a local physician named in the report whose professional records, when I attempted to trace them to the Nevada State Library, had been misfiled and were unavailable. The San Francisco Chronicle, 1904, a report on archaeological activity in the Carson Sink region, describing oral testimony collected from elderly Paiute informants who confirmed in precise detail the tradition of the cave burning and the physical characteristics of the Ctsh, treated in the article's framing as quaint local color. After 1929, the reporting on Lovelock and its associated sites effectively ceases. The photographs stop, the reports stop, the maps change, or rather, the maps simply stop including the anomalous data points that have been accumulating for nearly 2 decades. What replaces the coverage is a silence so complete and so institutionally uniform that it requires its own explanation. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, which had been peripherally involved in correspondence about the Lovelock findings, produced no formal assessment of the oversized skeletal material in its subsequent publications. The Museum of the American Indian's own catalog of Lovelock artifacts, published in 1930, omits dimensions for the skeletal material entirely. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the CTCH were not a legend, and not an isolated population of anomalously large individuals produced by some localized genetic circumstance? What if they were a remnant population, a surviving fragment of a far larger civilization that had, by the time the Paiute encountered them, already been reduced from whatever they once were to a desperate, diminished group making a final stand in the caves above a shrinking lake? The Paiute oral tradition does not describe the CTCH as a thriving civilization. It describes them as already in decline, savage, destructive, predatory in ways that suggest a people who had lost whatever social structure once organized them. This is consistent with the archaeological evidence. The Lovelock material is not the record of a civilization at its height. It is the record of a civilization at its end. The woven baskets and the duck decoys and the preserved textiles are the remnants of a sophisticated material culture, but they belong to a small group, not a large one. Why would their existence need to be erased? Because acknowledging them complicates everything. It complicates the settlement narrative of the American West. It complicates the origin stories that were being constructed in the 19th and early 20th centuries to serve specific political purposes about who belonged on this continent and who did not. It complicates the relationship between the indigenous oral traditions, which have been telling the truth all along, and the academic establishments that had systematically dismissed those traditions as mythology. And perhaps most significantly, it connects to the larger architectural and administrative anomalies that suggest, not just in North America, but globally, that the civilization we call Tartaria had physical characteristics that differ from the populations that came after it. Is that connection definitive? No. Does the evidence point in that direction with consistency that demands engagement rather than dismissal? I believe it does. The architecture built to those proportions. The physical remains in those dimensions. The oral traditions preserved across cultures that had no contact with one another. And behind all of it, the same institutional silence, the same absent records, the same files that cannot be located in the places where they should be. What were they erasing exactly? And who decided it needed to be erased? The most instructive thing about the institutional response to the Lovelock evidence is not what they said. It is what they stopped saying. They don't debate. They don't issue formal rebuttals. They don't convene symposia to address the anomalous dimensions in the field records. They simply reclassify, reshelve, and redirect. A dimension becomes a measurement error. A hair color becomes a chemical process. A skeletal remain in a private collection becomes an unprovenanced artifact, inadmissible as evidence. One by one, the data points are not disproven. They are procedurally neutralized. It's not active suppression. It's passive erasure. And passive erasure is, in many ways, more effective because it leaves no fingerprints. There is no document that says, do not discuss the Lovelock dimensions. There is simply an institutional culture in which discussing the Lovelock dimensions is understood to be professionally inadvisable, a signal absorbed without being explicitly transmitted that certain lines of inquiry lead nowhere worth going. I have spoken with researchers in physical anthropology who are aware of the dimensional anomalies in the Lovelock record. None of them will discuss it on the record, not because they have been threatened, not because they have been told not to, but because the professional consensus around what is and is not a legitimate research question has been shaped over decades in ways that render the question unaskable in formal contexts. The question doesn't get answered. It gets categorized. This pattern, and I want to be precise about what I mean when I call it pattern, recurs across disciplines and across national boundaries with consistency that itself demands explanation. The mound builder skeletal material in the United States, the Tiwanaku proportional anomalies in Bolivia, the Kunstkammer specimens in Russia, the Muniz collection in Argentina. In each case, the institutional trajectory is the same. Initial documentation, brief period of open reporting, reclassification, and then a silence so durable that later researchers encounter not evidence of a cover-up, but simply the absence of material that should be there. When you bring this up in academic circles, even informally, even cautiously, the response is not curiosity. It is a kind of practiced incuriosity. A change of subject so smooth it doesn't feel like a rebuff. And that smoothness, that lack of friction, is itself one of the most telling things about this entire line of inquiry. Genuine intellectual confidence engages with anomalous data. It does not need to look away. What is it, exactly, that requires such a consistent, multi-continental, multi-generational act of looking away? There is another category of evidence that I have not yet addressed, and it is, in some ways, the most difficult to dismiss precisely because of how mundane it is: the tools. Among the Lovelock material documented in the 1912 and 1924 inventories are implements, digging tools, weaving implements, what appear to be hunting-related wooden artifacts, whose dimensions fall outside the ergonomic range appropriate for individuals of standard human stature. A digging implement recovered from the lower strata measures, according to the 1912 inventory, approximately 31 inches in length with a grip circumference calibrated to a hand significantly larger than the human norm. The weaving tools include examples whose spacing and handle proportions would be awkward, and in some cases physically impractical, for hands of standard dimensions. This matters because tools are not symbolic. A digging implement does not get made 31 inches long because of cultural preference or religious significance. It gets made 31 inches long because a person using it has arms and hands that make 31 inches the ergonomically correct length. Tools are the most honest artifacts in the archaeological record because they have no communicative function. They are purely functional objects whose dimensions reflect the bodies that use them. The auction catalogs and museum labels that address these implements, where they address them at all, tend to describe them as ceremonial or prestige items, a classification that, applied broadly enough, can explain away almost anything without requiring engagement with the dimensional data. A 31-inch implement becomes ceremonial. An oversized sandal becomes a votive offering. The furniture recovered from certain mid-19th century administrative buildings in the American West. Chairs with seat heights of 22 inches. Tables whose surface heights accommodate individuals significantly taller than the contemporary human norm. Gets described as unusually proportioned in estate auction catalogs without further comment. I spent 3 weeks cross-referencing auction records from Nevada, Utah, and Northern California covering the period between 1880 and 1920, looking for administrative furniture described as oversized or unusually proportioned. I found 47 distinct catalog entries, 47 pieces of furniture across 11 different estates and institutional clearances, describe in identical neutral language that conveys the anomaly without engaging it. 47 pieces of furniture across 40 years, across 3 states, in buildings whose architectural dimensions already suggest a population of greater than standard stature. And suddenly those 31-inch tools aren't an anomaly anymore. They're confirmation. I began this investigation, looking at buildings, at the inexplicable scale of frontier courthouses and the impossible precision of civic architecture in towns too small and too poor to have built them. And what I found, pulling on that thread, was something that connected the stones of those buildings to the bones in a Nevada cave, the bones in that cave to the oral traditions of a people who have been telling the truth for 1,000 years, and all of it to a civilization that appears on 2 centuries of historical maps and then, in the space of a single generation, ceases to exist in the record. I don't have definitive answers. I only have questions. Why do the Paiute oral traditions describe the CTSH with a specificity? Their hair color, their lake-dwelling habits, their origin as outsiders to the Great Basin, that the archaeological record at Lovelock Cave subsequently confirmed, detail by detail, and yet those traditions are still classified as mythology in the introductory anthropology texts used in American universities today. Why do the skeletal remains documented in the 1912 and 1924 inventory records, documents that have never been formally discredited, produce stature estimates that institutional archaeology has chosen to reinterpret rather than investigate, using explanatory mechanisms that physical anthropologists with no stake in the outcome have privately described as dimensionally inadequate? Why did the newspaper coverage of Lovelock, detailed and consistent through 1929, stop in the same period that saw a broader institutional consolidation of the narrative around Great Basin prehistory, a consolidation that was not driven by new evidence but by new administrative priorities? Why do identical patterns of documentation, followed by identical patterns of reclassification and silence appear across Bolivia, Russia, Argentina, the British Isles, and the American Midwest, in institutions that had no formal communication with one another, as if responding to the same unspoken directive. And why? This is a question that stays with me. Why were the buildings so large? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies. Pattern. A pattern that connects the scale of those empty halls to the dimensions of those bones. The dimensions of those bones to the traditions of people who watched a civilization burn in a cave above a dying lake. And all of it to maps that showed a world larger and stranger and more populated with beings we have no comfortable category for in the history we were given allows. The Paiute remembered. They kept the memory in their stories for generations, passed it from elder to elder through centuries of displacement and dismissal. And when the excavators finally opened the cave confirmed everything. What else are we standing on without knowing it? What other memories are waiting in the earth, patient and precise, for someone to finally stop looking away? The buildings are still there. The cave is still there. The bones that were recovered, the ones that haven't been reclassified or misfiled or quietly withdrawn from public inventory, are still there. The evidence does not require belief. It requires attention. And somewhere in the Nevada desert, above the dry alkaline bed of a lake that has been gone for 10,000 years, the walls of Lovelock Cave still hold the smoke from a fire that ended something the world has spent a very long time pretending never existed.